we go. Kevin Maston. I have two old Sony TA-FE 230 amplifiers. Should I run Klipsch RP 6000, 6000F and RP 504C with them, or 4 Dolly Alteco C1 Atmos speakers? I don't know what those Dolly ones are.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with those.
I'll be honest, I'm not sure what the question is. You got two old amplifiers. So I'm assuming did Sony make like amplifiers, or is that like an AVR kind of thing?
I just got to pull it up.
Yeah. The RP 6000F, or there's 6.5-inch drivers, dual horn tweeter. RP 504Cs, their center channel. So he's saying, should he run? Oh, okay. So basically, that's his whole system. He's got 2 Klipsch up front and a center channel. So that's 3 up front. And then he's got 4 Dolly Atmos speakers. And should he use the Sony on? My thought, honestly, depending on what kind of AVR you have, more than likely, your AVR is probably going to have better power amplification than the Sony does. Unless it's like maybe another Sony AVR. So, that's a hard call. Let us know what kind of AVR you've got. Kevin said, yeah, he's got a Denon 4700. So to me, I think the Denon probably has better amplification than the Sonys. So I'd put the Denon on the Klipsch and the 504C, and then let the Sony amplifier power your Dollies. But you may even be able to power everything with that Denon. That's got a decent amplifier in it.
Just looking at these Dollies, so they look like
they may not be super efficient on the Dollies.
Those are the Dollies there.
Okay.
Yeah, they look.
What's their sensitivity, Joe? What does it say?
Let's see something.
Those look cool. I like the way they look.
Well, careful comparing sensitivities between Klipsch. We all know that.
But the reality, I know everybody bashes them for that. They're like, oh, they inflate their. Okay, yeah, if they inflate their numbers, fine. But I can tell you right now, you put a speaker, most speakers, up against a Klipsch speaker, and you're going to be turning your volume up quite a bit more with the other speaker
because the treble is all up.
So,
well, I know from experience that Klipsch rates at least 6 dB higher.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. But you're still, like I said, I've had SVS and Klipsch in the same room, and I had to turn the SVS up quite a bit more.
Yeah, I think generally SVS are probably in the mid 80s, and the Klipsch are like mid to upper 80s.
So let's say, so I had at that time I probably had the RF73s, which are 101, I think, what they claim. And then the SVS Ultra Towers. Let's see what those are rated at. So those are rated specs. Those are rated at. Did they say? Oh, sensitivity 88 dB. So yeah, there's an obvious difference.
Really realistic.
But even if you do like 6 dB difference, is a lot of difference. That's noticeable difference, right?
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying.
And you do Aaron's subtraction, so 101 minus what, Aaron?
6 dB, so you're still 95 dB. So you would have to double the amplification.
Yeah,
you'd have to double the amplification 3 times to get the same volume.
Yeah, so yeah, it's noticeable.
So that's what I'm saying.
The other thing, though, from doing the calibration, I've done some calibrations on both Klipsch and SVS, and actually did one where the client switched from Klipsch to SVS. And so I've done the measurements on them and things like that. And one thing I did notice is because the Klipsch usually has a rising treble response, right? I think that they're also accounting for that extra treble also.
Like for the volume.
Right? So when I end up lowering the treble down to maybe something more similar to a neutral response, then it starts getting even closer. Does that make sense, what I said, Aaron?
Yeah.
Like, technically speaking, would it make sense that if the treble is lifted, that lowering it down would get it to a more similar sensitivity? Yeah, for
sure.
What is the sensitivity range?
You notice the treble more anyway. So,
what range do you measure for sensitivity?
Oh, I just do an average of 300 to 3K. 300 to 3K.
Okay.
Yeah, and different manufacturers do different things. Like some will take kind of like what you're talking about. Some might say, well, we've got a boosted high end, so we're going to take the highest output at whatever frequency it occurs. So if it's boosted 5 dB above 3 kilohertz at 10 kilohertz, then they'll say, hey, this is our sensitivity. It's 90 dB when average or sensitivity is like 85.
Yeah.
So it just depends. And then other manufacturers will specify at 1 kilohertz. This is what it is. So if there's a dip there, then it's worse for them. Or if there's a boost there, the number looks better. So that's why I say you've got to be careful when you compare and just be cognizant of what you're comparing. You know what? Manufacturers rate things different ways.
The funny thing is, like, for most home theater applications, wattage is probably the thing that I'd look at the least for some reason. Like,
I never ever look at power. I seriously have never looked at power as a spec. I don't. There's no reason to.
It's
in my opinion.
I think once you get to the edge of, you know, the power rating, like, oh, I'm running these full range, I need the bass response to be a certain way. All right, you should definitely look at the power rating, and, you know, if you're running something full range, you want to get the most out of that, you're gonna probably use a lot of that power. But if you're cutting off at 80 hertz, you might be surprised how little power you actually need. I swear. I hope somebody does that experiment. I would love to see Michael's system. You cut off at 80 hertz, right, Michael?
Mm-hmm.
But you have a ton of power with that monolith, 60. Right? Your monolith 11X can put out as much power as you probably need.
Yeah, I think mine are rated. Now I have no idea how JTR. You know, do they inflate their ratings too?
Probably not.
I think mine are 102 dB sensitive.
Yeah, I don't think JTR. I'm trying to remember when I tested theirs, but I feel like they don't.
So mine are. I'm looking at them 101 dB with 2 volts, which I don't know what that means. I'm used to saying like 1 watt. So I don't know what 2 volts would be.
So, you know, so here's what I would. Yeah, go ahead, Aaron. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, there's a really good website if you're curious about this. I'll throw it in the chat for just people to play around with.
Yeah, there you go.
But it does a really good job of giving you an idea of what your actual output might be. So, for example, I took a speaker that says average sensitivity 85 dB, amplifier power 1 watt, distance 12 feet. So, say about 4 meters or so. For a home theater, I think that's probably reasonable. Maybe 10 feet is more average, but we're just going to say 12 feet because that's kind of a far distance. Number of speakers 2 in a room, and so that's 76. That's like 77 dB off of 1 watt. So let's say you have a 200 watt amplifier, right? If you actually feed that speaker 200 watts, that's going to be 100 dB at the listening position. That's I don't think people realize how not loud they listen to their speakers.
Yeah.
You're not listening to average SPL of 100 dB at your listening. You're just not.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
So
right. It doesn't take a lot.
Safe. Let's say if you're cutting off at 80 hertz, what do you think most people, like if we took a poll and if we knew how much actual power they're drawing from their amplifiers, what do you think it would be? What would be your guess? Like, let's say
my guess is probably like 15, 30 watts.
I think maybe that. I really believe that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's like tremendous.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember this.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I had a Yamaha receiver and I was running all clip speakers. At that time, I think I had 5 speakers. So it was just a 5.1 system, Yamaha receiver, and it was handling it just fine. When I added the last 2 pair to make a 7.1, it took a dive big time. And I noticed it. I'm like, what is the deal? And at that time, I didn't understand how it was sharing the load of that power supply. And so I cranked it up to about the same volume as what I was used to with the 5 speakers, but it still never sounded the same. And I think what happened was it was just running out of gas. Like just the actual power supply, I was like, this is more than I can really handle. And so it just started sounding strained. It wasn't as good as with just 5 speakers.
Interesting.
But when I looked online, it was saying that when you add like 5 speakers, you went from 140 watts a channel to about 55 watts a channel.
Which amp was this again?
That was a Yamaha RXV 1800.
Okay.
So that was my first kind of real like nice amp or AVR. So that's probably 15 years ago when I first moved into this place. So I bought it on Craigslist for $400. It was a $1,200 AVR, a couple years old. I think it did Dolby DTS Master and True HD. So that was my first high definition, high resolution AVR.
So it didn't like that extra load, huh?
And I added 2 more speakers, and they were about the same sensitivity as the rest of my system. But I added 2 more speakers, and I was like, it's just not the same. Like 5.1 sounded better than 7.1.
That's interesting.
But I think it just legitimately was running out of gas.
Yeah, that's interesting. And even at low volume, you probably could tell, huh?
Yeah, because I had to crank it quite a bit to get it at the same volume. But even when I got about the same volume, it just sounded strained.
Huh.
Like it was struggling with it.
That's interesting.
I've seen manufacturers rate their amplifiers or their AVRs like that, like with just 2 channels, and then with all 5 channels.
Yeah, they
can
all
always see. But I mean, you can pretty much look at the back of it and see what their wattage output is, right?
I see.
What their
how big.
So their power supply starts sagging. Yeah, I mean, they're not going to keep up with that, which is one reason why it is good to have separate amplifier. If for no other reason than a couple channels, you know. And then I think my old system, that's what I was doing, was my main channels were all externally amplified, but I was using 2 of the rear channels from the AVR to power the side surround.
Is there something that you could use, like some kind of watt meter, where you just plug it in to the wall, and just see how much draw you
could do that for sure. I mean, you kind of have to do the math on it to figure out like what your voltage is and stuff like that. But they actually make like watt meter things that it's like an interface that plugs into the wall, and you plug the thing into it, so you can see what you are actually drawing. But I think if I had to guess, I would say just kind of given the typical listening distance of around like 9 to 12 feet, I'm guessing most people are probably on average like around 5 to maybe 15 or 20 watts.
So
if I had to guess, yeah, I mean, because I'm thinking like if you're sitting far, so Michael, you're coming at it from the perspective of home theater, and you've been in some big ones. Most of my audience is more like 2-channel people, and their rooms probably just aren't as large, so they're a little bit closer.
Sure.
Yeah, so I think like from that perspective, people are probably not using quite as much. Yeah. I think your estimation is probably also a good one if you factor in like dynamic range too. So, but yeah, certainly people aren't using all 200 watts at continuous. Yeah. That's just
I know guys in the Klipsch community, they're running literally tube amps that have 1 watt, 2 watts, 10 watts. And it'll blow you out of the room. Like it's got more than enough power, especially if they're running like the Klipsch horns, which are probably the most sensitive speaker that Klipsch makes.
Right. Yeah. So it just depends on your sensitivity of your speaker too. I mean,
and Fred
the distance that you're sitting and the sensitivity of the speaker, those are huge factors.
Sure.
So with those things that you plug into the wall, like those kilowatts, right? If it's reading out, let's say, all right, you're playing a loud part of the movie or whatever, all kinds of dynamic stuff is happening. How do the capacitors inside the amplifier affect that though? Because they're storing energy also. No,
no, you're right. I guess I don't follow the question.
I guess let's say if it's not a continuous thing, let's say it's drawing a little bit of power, but it's charging up these capacitors. So when there's a spike happening, it's not pulling the draw from.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Are you accurately measuring what it's pulling at that point in time and providing to the speaker versus also storing at the same? Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I don't know how you would, figure that out. I really don't, but that's a good question. So actually, these are good ideas for me to look into if I'm able to start testing and measuring amplifiers. I like these ideas. Like I want to try to measure multiple channels at the same time. So when I talk about building a dummy load where the resistors are $200 a piece, that's not just one. Like that's one channel. But if I'm doing multiple channels at the same time, I'm talking like tens of thousands of dollars for me to test amplifiers for people. Like. Dude, that Patreon money is going to have to skip up a whole bunch for that to happen.
Right.
Well, so here's the thing, though. Here's why I think it's important. Because if we find out, I don't know who's done this test. Maybe somebody else has. I haven't seen it. But if somebody does a test and they find out most people only need 50 watts, real watts, clean watts, not like fake,
Sure.
Then you know what? Then we don't have to do the whole faking of amplifier power. Because if all you need is 50, these companies don't need to fake. Oh, we do 180. You don't need to do that. If you can do 50 clean, we're happy. Okay.
And usually that's like peak volt or peak output too. That's not RMS output. And then those are the things that I personally kind of wonder how that impacts things, because your music or your movies have dynamic range. So you're playing like a 0 dBFS tone, like that's peak. But more than likely, when Sean and I discussed this, you're going to leave yourself some room. So maybe 6 dB of room, like on the master, right? Or if it's a really good master and it's got a lot of dynamic range, like classical music might have 20 dB of dynamic range. So I can't do that math in my head, but that's a lot of doubling of power that you might want to have on tap to provide you a big spike. So if I'm just making up numbers here and I'm saying, hey, I only need 1 watt on average to get me 90 dB at my listening, or let's say 80 dB at my listening position, but I've got music that has a 20 dB crest factor, then I'm going to need a boatload of power to hit that crest factor,
Right.
And it's so instantaneous that the speaker could probably take it, but that's also something that factors in too that I find interesting.
Rob at AV Rent has done the math. I'll be interested in seeing, what did he say? I like Rob over there at AV Rent. So yeah, I'm very curious to see. And also, what happens when you go 80 hertz versus 100 hertz, like the crossover, 100 versus 80 versus 60 versus 40 versus full range? I think that we're going to find out that those are making a huge difference in the amount of power that you need, right? Where you cross over, I think, is going to be a big thing.
Yeah.
So
I made a video about dynamic range well over a year ago. It might even be 2 years old now. And I've got all the crap on that and all that stuff if anybody's interested in.
You're not right.
I'm sure Keeping Up with the Joneses has sent something.
I'll share it. But I think it's hilarious. I got to email it to myself first.
Yeah, interesting.
Tristan the jokester.
I would love for these companies to focus more on the features, making stuff better that's noticeable instead of trying to play this game like, oh, you have more power, that's why you should spend more.
Well, it's a marketing. I mean, we realize that a lot of this stuff is marketing because numbers sell. I remember back in the day when I was working at Circuit City, if you had an AVR that was rated at, say, 120 watts versus 110 watts, it was a whole lot easier to sell 120 watts, even though you're not going to hear a difference in 10 watts. But people, more wattage, that's got to be better, right? That's worth the extra $200.
That's why they sell all those pyramid subwoofers, right?
Well, and think about, I kind of ragged the companies. We had Hobie on the other night, and I'm like, Hobie, I'm just going to ask the question. Why do you have a 16-inch subwoofer? Does it really measure 16 inches or is it really a 15? And you got a 13-inch. Is that really a 12-inch? And I was like, because I've measured some other brands' subwoofers, and they claim it's a 16. And at most, you're talking into the basket to the other end of the basket, it's 15 and a half. So they're rounding up, man. It's not even close.
Well, aren't the monoprice stuff kind of the opposite? Like they actually do it somewhat accurately?
That I don't know. I didn't measure as far as the actual physical dimensions, but he said that
it's almost always flange sized.
Yeah,
it's almost always, because if you take the SD of it and then back out the actual radius or the diameter from it, I've never seen in all my years of doing this, I've never seen a driver that is that's called a 12-inch that actually has 12-inch diameter of effective surface.
You've done the 13-inch monolith,
right?
Yeah, I don't think that's going to be a true 13-inch effective surface area. I don't have the stats on it, but I pretty much bet my clip on it.
Well, I think that's
just how it is. If you go and look at Matasound or Solin or Parts Express or anybody that sells raw drivers, JL Audio, any manufacturer that sells subwoofers, it's almost always flange size or close to it, or cutout diameter. Well, actually, it's not even cutout diameter. Definitely not that. So generally speaking, what I've learned is that if you see a driver that's rated at 13 inches, then you multiply that by about 0.85, and that'll get you the effective diameter. That which half surround to half surround is the effective diameter. So I was just throwing this video up here real fast. So I made a video about how to figure out how much amplifier power you actually need, depending on the media that you're using. So if it's really high dynamic range or it's not, there's a great website from Crown that has a good calculator on there. And then if you pair that up with one of these other websites, this dynamic range database, you can kind of get an idea of how much range your music generally has and get a better understanding of how much power you actually need. And I did a video a time ago. Yeah. So, there really is a science to it, as far as trying to understand what you do need and what you don't need.
Real quick.
It's not just guessing.
The reason I asked.
All right.
right, everybody. We do the Daily Hi-Fi podcast every Monday, 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So make sure you join up to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Daily Hi-Fi, and we will see you there for the big show every Monday. Yeah.